Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage Method Space, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Marc Anderson, and we're going to talk about context analysis as a method for literature reviews. But before we get started with that, if you are new to Method Space, this is a blog community sponsored by Sage Publishing. And we're interested in everything to do with designing, conducting, analyzing research, writing about it, sharing results in all different kinds of ways. And you can see at the heart of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think whether you are a brand new researcher or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. And that's why I enjoy doing these kinds of interviews, because I have a chance to learn all kinds of things from researchers from around the world. So welcome, Marc, and why don't you just start by introducing yourself?
Thanks, Janet. So my name is Marc Anderson. I'm an associate professor at Iowa State University, and I'm in the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship. And my area is organizational behavior, but my interests are a bit eclectic and span such things as philosophy of science and timing, social networks, personality. So a pretty broad range.
Well, I think our readers are people with eclectic interests too. So this interview, we're having this conversation as a part of a series for a special featured topic that was offered in the Organizational Research Methods journal about all different ways of thinking about review research and literature reviews. And I think, you introduce a very interesting approach. So maybe you could begin by just defining what you mean by citation context analysis.
Sure. So a citation context analysis looks at all the work that cites either a given focal article, or potentially it could be broader than that. It could concern a concept or a theory or a scholar's entire body of work.
Mm-hmm.
But it's easiest just to begin by thinking about one classic work. And if, for example, when I initially began being interested in this approach, I had read March and Simon's Organizations as a doctoral student, and I had seen it cited by hundreds of articles. I mean, lots and lots of the articles that I read in seminars cited it. And I was interested in social construction and how knowledge is created by scholars and contested and tested as well. And I wondered how people use March and Simon's classic book. The book was written in 1958. People are still citing it today. What are they citing it for? What's its lasting legacy, and what's its realized contribution? March and Simon had all kinds of views and ideas about what they were doing, but ultimately, once it's published, readers read it and think about it and use it and cite it for their own reasons. And often those can be very different than what the authors of a work intend or imagine their impact will be.
But that's very interesting, because I think, to look at the development of ideas over time and where they're used. I mean, you started in your introduction talking about your eclectic interest. You think, well, is a work regarded as seminal within one field, or is it picked up across disciplines? Is it of interest in say, one part of the world, or do people regard it as valuable, across cultures? What's the larger impact? I mean, we talk a lot about research impact, but this is really a way to understand impact,
Absolutely.
across, whether it's across a period of time throughout, to see, like, well, how did these ideas change? I mean, when I was teaching, I would talk with students who might be interested in, let's say, something like quote unquote emotional intelligence. Well, that was a term that's a more recent term. Well, what was that kind of thing called before? And how can you trace, oh well, as you say, how ideas are contested, where we say, oh well, that author, out of date, really missed the boat, or this part of it really worked and gets pulled forward, and then maybe another part of it gets left behind. So really is an interesting way to approach looking at the literature.
Yeah, most of the work that we produce and that we read uses citations, and that provides some history of the ideas. Now, not everything. It makes me think of the classic book, The Social Construction of Reality by Berger and Luckman, where they explicitly say, we're not going to cite everything. Mm-hmm. But the vast majority of work, even they built on previous authors. Mm-hmm. It's just they decided not to make it as apparent what those influences were. But when we cite something, like why are we citing it? And what knowledge or what claims are we citing it to help bolster and justify? And it's interesting because one of the things that I found in doing this kind of work, so many of our citations are really pretty superfluous, not essential. We could have cited 15 different articles. Mm-hmm. Like if I want to say that organizational learning is an important topic, I could cite all kinds of possible studies to justify that, whereas other work really requires, like if I'm citing an empirical finding, this study found that emotional intelligence matters for work performance. Then I need to, that really is that one study that matters. And the distribution of how many citations are essential and cite empirical results to bolster claims, and how many are sort of tangential, not essential, it has been quite interesting. And I think points out to how our citation practices really could be improved such that we could build on scholarship in a more rigorous and cumulative way. So throughout your article, you talk about the potential of this approach for theory development. Can you discuss that a little bit? Sure. Yeah, this is one area where I hadn't explicitly focused, and the reviewers and editor did a good job in saying, hey, think about tying this to theory more. One of the things that we want when we generate a theory is to know whether the theory is correct, whether the theory is adequate, explains some underlying reality, what the limitations of the theory are, and how strong the evidence for the theory is. And typically, if we go back to a seminal article that presents theory, we're not going to know any of that. We're going to know what the authors thought at that one point in time. We won't know how their thinking has progressed over time. And more importantly, we won't know how many times that theory has been tested and what criticisms have been raised against that theory. And that's what I think is one of the most interesting contributions of a citation context analysis, is that you can find all of those things. If I find all the work that cites a particular study, then I can see, did those authors actually test it? Did their empirical results support or refute it? Did they raise challenges and argue that certain aspects of the theory are limited or problematic? And by doing those things, I think that really helps understand the theory and develop the theory, assess whether the theory is correct in a way that other reviews typically can't do as systematically. So I put one of the tables from your article on a slide here. So I'd like to just
take a look at that. And I
Sure.
think it would be helpful to our readers who will have a chance to read the article, but maybe just to walk through some of these steps, like how would you
Sure.
go about doing this kind of an analysis?
Absolutely. So the first thing is to figure out what you want to review. Just like any literature review, you have to know, well, what's
Mhm,
the topic or what's the purpose of the review.
mhm,
And typically with the citation context analysis, it's going to be trying to assess the contribution of a particular work. It might be a
mhm,
seminal work. One of my studies looked at Walsh and Ungson's classic 1991 article on organizational memory. So how
mhm,
has that work been used? So figuring out what the focus of the review
mhm,
is the starting point, and then thinking about the boundaries involves, are you going to try to get every single paper that cited that seminal work or not? In the case of March and Simon's book, there are over 25,000 citations to it. There's no way we're going to actually look at all 25,000, in part because gathering the citation context takes time. So generally, what most work would do is choose a subset of top journals. Those journals have the biggest impact, the biggest
mhm,
visibility anyway. So figuring out the scope of the review for certain smaller topics, you might be able to look at every single paper. I'm involved with
mhm,
one project right now where that's what we're doing. It's a specific concept. So we're trying to get every work, regardless of what journal it is,
mhm,
that has mentioned that. Then the next step, and eventually computers will do this for us, but we're
mhm,
not quite there yet. It's a little bit time consuming. You need to search all of the articles that you've identified as citing the focal work to find the specific passage that
mhm,
actually contains
mhm,
the citation. And you need to make sure that you have enough of the content around that citation to make sense of it. So
mhm,
sometimes someone might cite someone for a definition, in which case it's clear. You know, Carl Weichs defines enactment as, and here's the sentence, and there you go. That's all you
mhm,
need. But other times it's a little bit more challenging to figure out, why are they citing this particular
mhm,
work? What are the claims being made about it? So typically you create a database that would have all this information, the actual text containing the citation, the surrounding text, and then if you're doing this with another research partner, which is better if you can, then you try to figure out what types of reasons are people citing this work for. So that's
mhm,
what the codes refer to, the codes and categories. So
mhm,
it might be a particular definition, it might be a particular topic, like for March and Simon, a lot of citations concern bounded rationality. A lot of other citations concern routines. So we would create a category on that, and then discuss with your co-author, come up with what we think is a good set of categories, then actually read through all of the citation contexts, which in the case of March and Simon, we had, I believe, something like 2,400, a little more than 2,400,
mhm,
and assign a code to all of those. Then you want to check whether you're in agreement and why you might not be in agreement. And all of that is the background then to try and actually assess what the results mean. Like
mhm,
what's valuable about doing this. Also, as you're coding the citation context, we looked for any context that referred to empirical evidence, or any context that seemed to be challenging, seemed to be
mhm,
saying something's wrong with this claim.
right.
And our work suggests that very few citations actually are critical, and very few, at least of the works that I've done, which typically are bigger, kind of more seminal books, specifically refer to an empirical finding or an empirical claim. Now, I would imagine with certain, like if citations to a meta-analysis probably would be much more likely to just focus on one particular claim, but that probably wouldn't be as interesting. If you found that of 500 people that cite this meta-analysis, 450 report the result, okay, you probably wouldn't warrant this kind of analysis. But when it comes to certain types of works that make multiple claims, that have lots of potential concepts that someone might cite them for, then it becomes a little more interesting to see why. And so yeah, that's in essence then writing up what the most interesting results are and thinking about how you can help advance and develop the theory and the assertions, identify new directions that work needs to do, and maybe reassess what the contribution of the work is. So in the case of our work that looked at March and Simon's organizations, March and Simon are very explicit that they want to create an empirical study of organizations. And they put forth their propositions, like something between 1 and 200 propositions, expecting that future work would test those. And in 5 or 10 years, we would have all this empirical evidence that would tell us which of those propositions were true and which weren't, and which maybe needed to be revised. And I actually had the good fortune to present an early version of that work to Jim March back in 2006. And it was clear that that vision of an empirical test of all of their assertions did not happen, has not happened, and is not the contribution of that book, which in a way, I mean, I think it's a bit disappointing. Like, why didn't we develop a more empirical assessment of their propositions? And I don't know that I know the answer to that, but I do come away from my studies in this area with the feeling that we need to do a better job of linking up our empirical results with previous studies that have hinted at what why it might be relevant. And at this point, it's hard to do that because we don't know how these works link together. And citation context analysis is at least one way to establish some of those links, so you could go back and say which of these propositions. Initially, I had envisioned doing a study where I would look at all of those propositions and try to assess what the empirical evidence for and against them were. But it became clear that there's really so few subsequent works relate their work back, that trying to do that would be incredibly challenging.
So it's interesting that the work was cited extensively, but not further developed.
Exactly. And a lot of times in our
But that would
field,
be something that you wouldn't know if you hadn't done this kind of an analysis.
yeah, I think too often we read an assertion and we treat it as if it's true, when really the empirical evidence for it is very limited. I know there have been some studies looking at articles published in the Academy of Management Review and whether they've been tested in the future. And the vast majority of those propositions are never tested, and yet they're often treated as if they're true. Now, in some cases, the proposition represents a summary of some empirical work, so that's okay. But in other cases, with brand new theory, if it's never being tested and subsequent authors cite it as if it's true, that's not really creating an empirical science that probably has a close resemblance to reality.
Right. Well, I think, hearing you talk, I think about, for student researchers and researchers who are looking for a good topic to study for their dissertations or theses, that doing this kind of an approach would, help to surface, well, what assumptions have been made or discussed in respected books or articles that haven't been tested. Oh, well, maybe that's something you could do. So, maybe
Yeah.
that's, would help people to point to, where there is a need for more research.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it makes me think of two things. First of all, when I've like one of the good things about this kind of research is that it doesn't require you to find a bunch of companies that have hundreds of willing
Mm,
managers who will let you
mhm,
interview and
mhm, mhm,
survey them, which can be daunting for PhD students. So this is a type of research that can be done without a huge investment in resources, and the data is there. It
mhm,
needs to be collected and aggregated, but it exists and it's
mhm,
relatively straightforward to get. But with respect to your other point about looking at why people cite a work can surface reasons or things in that work that haven't been cited that represent missed opportunities. And I did a citation context analysis of Carl Weick's classic book, The Social Psychology of Organizing. And there were some of my favorite concepts from that book. The things that I thought were most interesting had not been cited at all.
huh,
So really hadn't made much of an impact.
hmm,
And I thought that's interesting. So for example, Carl Weick talks about how typically there's what he calls a theoretical trade-off between generality, simplicity, and accuracy. And his argument is, and he builds this on another scholar's work named Thorngate, but that you can only have two of those three. Well, to me, that raises all kinds of interesting questions in our field. Where are we making these trade-offs? Why
mhm,
are we making these trade-offs? Are there certain theories or topics where we're making different kinds of trade-offs that
mhm,
might lead to a need for future research? So you're right, it can raise new theoretical questions that haven't been
mhm.
addressed and that are forgotten, but nonetheless are really interesting. And
Well, so one of the other things that comes to mind hearing you talk, I think, well, say for example, if concept A is cited over and over again, so the reader is saying, "Oh, well, here's concept A, concept A, concept A," and so it kind of it's sort of self-perpetuating because
mhm.
they, unless they're going back to the original work, and are they only looking for what the author said about concept A, and they're not looking, oh, well, here were these other really interesting things, but because they hadn't been picked up, they don't get, revisited.
Yeah, well, and that raises an interesting issue of that also relates to kind of the legacy of concepts. I did another study, which wasn't a citation context analysis, but Peter Sun from the University of Waikato in New Zealand, and I looked at the classic paper on a concept called absorptive capacity, which is very similar to a concept called organizational learning. And we
Mhm,
looked at that classic initial paper. They tend to cite the concept of organizational learning a lot and really treat it as a synonym.
mhm,
But
mhm,
once that paper was published, a lot of work began only focusing on this term absorptive capacity and neglecting the literature on organizational learning and treating them as sort of
mhm.
separate things. And when really it was sort of relabeling the concept
Right,
that
right,
existed with a new, flashier, sexier label that then uh,
right.
separates or creates a divergence in the overall understanding, which probably, arguably isn't what reflects the kind of the what we should be doing in scholarship.
Mhm. Right, but I could see how, because new terminology comes up, and the people reading the work using the new terminology may not even realize that, this is not actually new. We were talking about this before, just using a different term. But the one other thing that comes to mind, since I'm uh, a researcher who writes books
Mhm.
as well, and I've actually just done some writing about the process of writing subsequent editions, what that entails. And so
Uh-huh.
I think, well, gee, if you had written a book a while back, it would be interesting to do a citation analysis to see, how was your book used? What questions were raised, or where did people go like, didn't like that?
Yeah.
That would help you to really think about, what, how you want to build on your own work. We have a lot of, our method space readers who are, researchers who are writing, and, across your career, you have a chance to see how your own work is developed. I mean, I've written about online research, and I started writing about this a long time before the pandemic. But during the
Mhm.
pandemic, things are, so it would be interesting, to hearing this. I think, well, it would be interesting to go back and see, well, which of my books were cited and how were they cited, and how could that inform how you move forward. So I think what you're
Yeah.
describing is a valuable tool for researchers and writers to use, to understand the development of their own work, especially, as you're looking across your career, and how the work was used or not. Like,
Yeah.
what did you think was really fabulous but nobody else noticed?
Yeah, the issue of determining impact is really crucial to a scholarly career. And how we typically do that is just assess how often a work is cited. And we treat that number of citations as being an indicator of whether this work had an impact or not. But that's a very superficial and misleading indicator, because so many citations are so superfluous and
Right.
non-essential that even a work that's cited 500 times, which, wow, hasn't that had a big impact? Often it really hasn't had much of an impact. And one of the things that I've found quite interesting now, there's a platform called ResearchGate,
Mhm,
which
mhm,
sends emails to me whenever one of my works is cited, and it has the
mhm,
citing source, and it'll often give the sentences that contain the citation context. And many times I've read that and I've thought, that's not what my work says. Like, where did these authors get this idea from
mhm.
my work? And at this point, there's not really a good mechanism for correcting that sort of thing. So now someone
Right.
else might read that person's faulty citation and then start citing me for that further and just compounding the error. But yeah, I like your idea of thinking about, okay, so I had hoped to make 5 key claims in this article, but only
Mhm,
2 of them have been cited in future work. Maybe, like, why is that? What can I do
mhm,
if I really
mhm,
think those other claims need to be out there and need to
mhm.
influence future scholarship? Then you're right, that's another way to help develop theory.
Right, right. Well, I think this is a very useful approach, whether done in a, large scale with a big body of work, or, just tracing something over a period of time, to look, at a more, narrow question. But, I hope that our readers will take a look at your article, which I think, really lays out, it explains the steps very clearly, and would help someone to get started with this approach. So thank you for taking the time to talk with us about it, and explain a little bit about how this approach could be useful.
You're very welcome, Janet. I've enjoyed talking with you about this, and I'm excited to see what future scholars do with my paper and how they use this.
Right. Thank you.